Sample a lot of different kinds of beer.
Again, thank all of you for coming. I'm sure you enjoyed this wonderful meal. I certainly did. Thank you to the committee for all of their work. If there is a theme to our program series this year, it might be getting to know your neighbors. We got to know Ed and Lynn Nyra as Ed shared his story of fleeing Cuba as a child to live in freedom in America. And we enjoyed the story of the Cromwells and their 3 generations in the jewelry business. In April, we will have the pleasure of getting to know Laura and Dawn Harrison a little bit better as they tell their story of growing up childhood sweethearts in a small Alabama town, pursuing their educations, Dawn's medical training, and their strong commitment to giving back to the community. Today, we will get to know our Quaker neighbors who have been in Indian Hill for 50 years in their Friends Meeting House. Thank you all very much. Mary Bramlage is going to introduce our speaker.
Just down the road where I live, on Keller Road, stands a quiet, unpretentious brick building that has a sign, Friends Meeting House. Sunday services, 11 a.m. And I wonder about that place. I frequently drive past it, but I've never been inside. I thought perhaps you might wonder about it too. One day last spring, I saw in the local paper something saying that the Quakers in Indian Hill were having a year-long bicentennial celebration. Well, here was some Indian Hill history that I didn't know, and I thought perhaps you didn't either. So I sought out Sabrina Darnowsky, a member of the Indian Hill congregation and author of a Quaker history book. And let me tell you a bit about Sabrina, and then I'll show you. Sabrina graduated from Rhode University with a degree in Spanish and education, but she soon discovered that her true calling was writing. For most of her career, she worked as a technical writer for software companies. More recently, though, she's found ways to integrate her professional skills with a growing interest in history. In 2006, led by a desire to affiliate with one of the historic peace churches, she began attending Cincinnati Friends Meeting here in Indian Hill. 4 years later, she began researching and writing a history of that congregation in anticipation of their 200-year anniversary. The result was this beautiful 252-page book entitled Friends Past and Present, the Bicentennial History of Cincinnati Friends Meeting. Now, after Sabrina speaks to us in a couple minutes, if you want to learn more about the Quakers or like to have this information to take home with you, the books are up here for sale on the table, and I'm sure Sabrina would autograph it for you. She also has brought some DVDs that have been made about Levi Coffin, who was the leader of the Underground Railroad. She spoke about this topic, about Levi Coffin and his role, when she spoke at the Bicentennial History and Genealogy Conference last spring. We are very grateful to Sabrina to be here today to share the history of Quakerism and the path that took Friends from 17th century England to the simple meeting house on Keller Road. Sabrina?
There we go. For a technical writer, technology can still sometimes be challenging. But thank you for that introduction. As Susan mentioned, we have been here, Quakers have been here in Indian Hill for about 50 years, but we have a fairly low profile. And people passing by might wonder, who are these people? What do they believe, and how did they get here? Our journey begins in 17th century England with a young man named George Fox. Now, when he was even just in his 20s, he was a spiritual seeker, but very discouraged by what he saw as the religious life in England at the time. He felt that the clergy people were treating their positions not as a calling, but as rather a job. There were many people who professed to be Christian, but were not living according to principles that Fox felt reflected that faith. And so he began traveling around the countryside, talking to clergy in the Church of England, talking to some of the dissenting ministers who were popping up in that period, and not finding the answers that he was seeking in terms of understanding the relationship between God and humankind. He found it very discouraging. And at one point, he was out walking in a field, getting utterly depressed about the situation, and he heard a voice. He heard the voice of God say to him, "There is one, even Christ Jesus, who can speak to thy condition." It was his road to Damascus moment. It changed his life, and it changed the lives of the thousands of people who would come to follow him. One of the distinctive perspectives that this encounter gave to Fox is that authentic faith comes from a direct experience of God, that no intermediaries were needed. It wasn't about going to church and singing hymns. It was about a personal encounter. Fox believed that there is a divine presence within each and every human being. And he had a number of names for that. He would refer to it as the inward teacher, the inner light, the seed, and believed that this divine presence existed in all people, even those who weren't familiar with the historical Jesus. And although Fox knew Scripture, they often said that George Fox had the Bible memorized, and if we lost every copy of it, he could recreate it from his memory. He tended to view Scripture as an account of other people's experiences, but felt that it was the first-hand experience that was more important and more authentic. He would sometimes say, well, Paul says this and Peter says that, but what canst thou say? What is your experience of God? How has the truth been revealed to you personally? Quakers refer to this as continuing revelation. So, if you believe that God still speaks to us today, how would that affect worship? Well, for Quakers, the focus is on listening. Quaker worship, if you come to Cincinnati Friends meeting or many other meetings, tend to have a great deal of silence. It's not really intended to be meditation, but it is an opportunity to listen to the still, small voice of God and be led by its guidance. As I mentioned, Fox was very dissatisfied with the clergy at the time. They sometimes say that Fox did not do away with the clergy, he did away with the laity. Believing that if God can speak to me, God can speak to anyone. God can speak through anyone. So Quakers approach ministry as a shared responsibility. When we sit in silence, we may hear that still small voice speaking to us, and we're asked to test it. Is this just a message for me? Is it something that I'm supposed to share with a friend? Or is it a message that's meant for everybody? And if it's meant for everybody, and you feel this irresistible urge to rise to your feet and speak, then you do that. One of the things that was also very distinctive about 17th century Friends is that there were sects at that time who argued that women did not have souls. George Fox did not agree with that at all. In fact, he believed that both men and women could and should bring ministry. So we have had women in ministry since the 1600s. A little aside for women, Quakers also believe very much in equality, such that our wedding vows, there are no distinctions between what the men say and what the women say. Quaker women do not have to obey. So, given that we have this perspective of God being in all of us and being able to speak through all of us, we even arrange the worship rooms in such a way that reinforces that idea. What we call facing benches. Rather than having all of the pews facing a central pulpit, which kind of confers central authority on that individual at the pulpit, we have benches, as you can see in this image, where people are facing one another, seeing that of God in each other, and being able to minister to each other. Fox also was very concerned about going back to what he perceived as primitive Christianity. He wanted to strip away all of the traditions and customs that had been layered on since the first century church. And so in a Quaker meeting house, you won't see crosses, you won't see stained glass, you won't see icons or any other kind of imagery. They tend to be very, very simple. So that the focus, again, is not on the outward. It is, and you might be able to roll our feet. I can use my pointer there. The focus is on, this picture is called The Presence in the Midst, and this is showing the presence of Christ within the meeting house itself, the central focus. As he said, Fox considered a spiritual experience an inward one, so Quakers do not observe outward sacraments. We do not engage in baptism. We do not engage in communion in the traditional sense. For us, baptism is what occurs when you are inwardly transformed by the Spirit. Communion occurs when we share a meal or otherwise share fellowship like we're doing here today. So the focus is on the inward. Now, Quakerism is also not just a distinctive way of worship, but it's meant to be a way of life. The acronym SPICE is something that a Quaker author, Howard Brinton, came up with in the 20th century, actually, that embodies the ways that we are called to live. And SPICE stands for simplicity, peace, integrity, community, and equality. So, how do you live those values? Well, for early Friends, one of the ways was what they called plain dress and plain language. In Fox's time, there was tremendous inequality of wealth, such that the more affluent members of society dressed very extravagantly, very rich, colorful fabrics and prints, lots of ribbons and embroidery and lace. And Fox thought, if we are all equal in the sight of God, then let us show that by dressing in a more common way. So they tended to wear blacks, grays, browns. The clothing was very simple, inornate, and the women wore bonnets. The men had their broad-brimmed hats, and you could typically recognize a Quaker on the street by their manner of dress. Plain language was another way that Fox promoted equality. Again, back in England, when you were addressing someone of higher social status, that's when you used you, your honor, your majesty. When you were talking to your family and friends, you would say thee and thou. And so Fox decided, I'm going to use that language with everybody, which caused quite a stir, and was not a way to make friends and influence people in 17th century England. But he felt it was very important that in all aspects of our life, we share these testimonies. One of the probably most famous aspects of Quaker faith is our commitment to peace. George had also often landed Quakers in prison because they were not willing to fight for their king. But at the same time, no pun intended, it was a double-edged sword because the royalty also realized that Quakers were therefore not going to fight against them. So that was somewhat helpful in gaining acceptance. Quakers have some peculiar practices. The idea of affirming rather than swearing in court. We talked about Spice. One of the letters was I, which stood for integrity. Fox believed that people should tell the truth at all times. So he had issue with the idea of one standard of truth for the courthouse and a separate standard of truth in everyday life. In fact, even today, modern Quakers get an exception. If I were to go to court and I would not have to swear on a Bible that I was telling the truth. I would be able to simply say, I affirm it. And there are, in fact, a number of legal statutes that have been written to accommodate some of the Quaker peculiarities. Some of it was a little esoteric. For example, you'll notice on this marker, Martha Bailey was born 4th month 28, 1863, died 7th month 7th, 1863. Early Quakers were uncomfortable with the fact that days of the week and months of the year were named after pagan gods and goddesses. So they decided to just enumerate everything. January is 1st month, February is 2nd month, Sunday is 1st day, Monday is 2nd day. So we don't have Sunday school, we have first day school. And if we watched football, we would watch first day night football. Of course, one of the things that, particularly in addition to refusing to take up arms for the king, that caused a lot of friction with the society at the time, was the refusal to pay tithes. Because there was a state religion, tithing was a requirement, and Quakers were not willing to do that and often ended up in prison over it. So, like many of the dissenting sects in the time, they sought religious freedom in other countries, coming to the colonies. But that did not always go well. For example, the Massachusetts colony was founded by Puritans who were very keen on religious freedom for Puritans, not so much for Quakers whom they considered heretics. Now, when Mary Dyer first came to Boston, she was a Puritan, settled in the area. But during one of her trips back to England, she encountered Quakers and was convinced that this was a better expression of her faith. When she came back to Boston, they informed her that she was banished. And at first she just went off and then resettled in Rhode Island. But she was deeply bothered by the persecution of Quakers in Massachusetts, and so she returned. And again, began being very open about her faith. And they at this point took her so far as to take her to the gallows and put the noose around her neck and tell her to recant, and she refused to. And they said, well, okay, we're going to let you go we're going to let you go this time, but if you come back, we are going to hang you. And again, she left, but again, wanting to make a statement for religious freedom, she came back, and this time they did, in fact, hang Mary Dyer. There is a statue to her in Boston today commemorating this event, and it was, in fact, the idea of hanging a woman that began to really start to make people question whether this was an appropriate response to people professing different types of faith. One of the biggest influxes of Quakers into North America, though, came with William Penn. Now, William Penn was the son of an admiral. His father had helped King Charles II, had helped his restoration to the throne, but he did not have enough financial resources to repay Penn's father for that act. So he decided, I'm going to settle it with your son. I've got all this land over in North America. Why don't you go take that and we'll call it even. And that, of course, became the colony of Pennsylvania. Now, William Penn was a Quaker, and for him, he wanted to find out what it would be like to have a government based on Quaker principles. One of the things that he did, even though King Charles II gave him that land, he recognized that there were indigenous people there who felt it was their land. So he, even though it had been freely given to him, decided to buy territory from the Indians. He also was first early in developing and negotiating treaties with the Indians so that they could live peacefully with one another. And it was a very successful relationship at the time. He was one of the few who never broke any of his treaties with Native Americans. He also developed, he created a constitution for the colony, and because of the idea of Quaker equality and community, he insisted that they have representative assemblies so that all people would have a voice in government. Because Quakers believe the truth is continually being revealed, he said, we're going to write this constitution, but we're going to have provisions so that it can be amended, because we might not know all of the truth right now. Things may be revealed to us over time. There was some capital punishment in Pennsylvania, mostly for treason, I believe, but in general, they tried to develop a criminal system that focused on restitution rather than punishment. Prisons were seen as places of reformation. In fact, the term penitentiary was a term that Quakers coined because they were hoping that in going to these prisons, that you would have time to reflect on what you had done and be penitent and turn your life around. There was, of course, because they had experienced so much persecution, they insisted on religious freedom. And again, with the commitment to peace and to integrity, he did not require oaths of loyalty and did not support war efforts. In fact, in a way, the combination of democracy and religious freedom and of opposition to war is partly what brought down Quaker leadership in Pennsylvania, because the Quaker leaders who opposed participation in the Revolutionary War were voted out of office. slavery in the American colonies was a significant concern for Quakers, although in fairness, it took them a while to get to that position. When George Fox originally visited Barbados in the 1600s, he did not immediately call for the abolition of slavery, but he did encourage slave owners to treat their slaves with kindness, and he recommended that they release them after a certain period of time of service. But the Quakers in 1688 in Germantown, Pennsylvania, wanted to make a stronger statement than that. And so they wrote a minute, a statement of opposition, of unconditional opposition to slavery. And it took a while for that to filter out into the wider community. For example, one of the first things that Quakers did was they decided to stop all involvement in the slave trade. They would no longer own the ships that brought slaves back and forth between Africa and America. And then they said, well, okay, you're not allowed to buy any imported slaves, but you are allowed to continue to buy domestic slaves, slaves that are already here. And then that gradually changed to, okay, you're not allowed to buy any new slaves, but you're still allowed to inherit slaves from your parents. And then that became, no, you're not allowed to have slaves. By about 1770s, Quakers were very united in their opposition to slavery. And it played a role in the migration to the Northwest Territory. There were, people came west for a number of reasons. They, like anybody else, they came in part to find new opportunities. Farmland was taken up in the east. Here they had an opportunity to start new farms, to start new businesses. There were, as I mentioned, the issue with the Revolutionary War. Some Quakers, when they refused to fight in the Revolutionary War, had their property confiscated. And so coming out to the Midwest was an opportunity for them to start over. And for a number of Quakers, especially those in Virginia, in North Carolina, coming to the Midwest was a way to get away from slavery. Quakers came to Cincinnati in the early 1800s. As early as 1811, they were just worshiping and meeting in one another's homes. But in 1813, they decided to buy their own meeting house. And even the meeting house has a little bit of association with slavery. It was, according to most accounts, it was built by a man named Peyton Short, who wanted to house his slaves in that building. And when Ohio came into the Union as a free state, Peyton Short decided to up and move to Kentucky. He sold his business, or he sold this building to Nicholas Longworth, who then sold it to the Quakers. As you can see in this map from 1815, this little red circle here was the meeting house on the very far edge of town. There was nothing to the west of us or south of us but forests. This is just on 5th Street, west of Central Avenue. So even though we built or we purchased the meeting house in 1813, we were not officially recognized as a monthly meeting of the Religious Society of Friends until 1815. Incidentally, the phrase monthly meeting is a little misleading. We do worship weekly. In fact, back in 1815, we worshiped on both first days and fifth days, which was Sundays and Thursdays. The term monthly meeting refers to the fact that we conduct our business meetings just once a month. Now, probably as Mary mentioned, one of the most famous members of Cincinnati Friends meeting was Levi Coffin, who was considered president of the Underground Railroad. Levi had grown up in North Carolina, had witnessed slavery firsthand, and found it unconscionable. He and his wife moved to Indiana for a period, and he owned a dry goods store, and became bothered by the fact that a lot of the goods he carried were the result of slave labor, cotton clothing, cotton blankets. And so he decided to commit himself to just having products that were produced by free labor. And was so good at lining up suppliers and everything that he was asked to come to Cincinnati to operate a warehouse because we were on the river. Lots of goods came through this area on the river boats. And he was to set up a warehouse so that other individuals, other businesses that wanted to provide only free labor goods could do so. He was also deeply involved in helping slaves escape from bondage in the South and come either to the northern United States or to Canada. It's estimated that he helped about 3,000 slaves escape and find new homes. There is, in fact, in our Quaker cemetery in Spring Grove, a monument that African Americans built to Levi Coffin as an expression of gratitude for the work that he did. Another really well-known Cincinnati abolitionist, at least in his time, was Achilles Pugh. And now he was the publisher of The Philanthropist, which was the official publication of the Ohio Anti-Slavery Society. And this was not a risk-free undertaking for him. Cincinnati being on the border between Ohio and Kentucky, there was still a fair amount of pro-slavery sentiment in Ohio. And there were occasionally riots in Cincinnati between the pro-slavery and the anti-slavery segments. And at one point, a mob decided in the 1830s, a mob decided to go to Achilles Pugh's printing press and break in, tear up the paper, spill the ink. They disassembled pieces of the press and they hauled it down to the Ohio River and threw it in the river. They even went to his house to make sure that he did not have any printing equipment down in his basement. And you can imagine how terrifying that must have been to have an angry mob at your front doorstep when your wife and child is in the house there with you. Fortunately, they didn't commit any acts of violence, and Pugh did eventually, this happened twice, but each time he went down to his printing house, literally picked up the pieces, and continued to publish The Philanthropist. In fact, most of you are familiar with the Taft Museum downtown. There's a building immediately to the north of that, which is the Pugh Building, which was not built by Achilles Pugh, but was built by his son. That printing business stayed in the family until about the 1980s. That building is now, I believe, condos or apartments, but it is a living testament to the presence of Quakers here in Cincinnati. Even after the Civil War, and when slavery was no longer an issue, Friends were very concerned in matters of social justice. When the slaves were coming into Cincinnati, many of them were completely uneducated, and Quakers set up schools, primarily as to provide religious education, but the fact that you're teaching someone to read the Bible, you're teaching them to read and to empower them to develop their own religious institutions in town. The Quakers were also deeply involved in vocational education for the poor, which typically meant setting up sewing schools for women so that they could do piecemeal work and supplement their family incomes in that way. I mentioned that the Quakers spent a lot of time in prison and have always been engaged in prison reform. One of my favorite Cincinnati Quakers was a woman named Mary J. Taylor. And she was a strong advocate, particularly for women in difficult circumstances, whether those were prostitutes, unwed mothers, or women who became involved in the penal system. At one point, the custom at that time was that women, when they were arrested, would be loaded onto the back of a cart and hauled off to jail through the streets, and everyone could see them and yell at them and throw things at them. Mary J. Taylor thought that was unnecessarily humiliating, and she went to the mayor of Cincinnati and insisted that the wagons be covered so that the women could at least maintain some dignity. women who went to prison often either took their children with them or had to leave them abandoned, wandering the streets during the day. And so a number of Quakers, Mary J. Taylor and her daughter Hannah, and a number of other Quaker women, were very concerned about this situation, and they set up a little facility in the basement of a building downtown so that they could take these children in, teach them, give them a warm meal, but soon realized that sending them out was just sending them into the streets for the night. And so they began providing them just a few children at a time, providing them with little cots so that they could spend the night at the school. Well, Mary J. Taylor's daughter Hannah was married to a man named Murray Shipley, who was a very successful businessman, and he decided out of his own resources to build a 3-story facility in downtown Cincinnati, and in 1864 that became the Children's Home, which recently celebrated its 150th anniversary here in town. One of the things that was kind of unique about the Children's Home was that they didn't believe that children should be institutionalized. They felt that the best place for children was within families. And Quakers being very well networked, they would often take these kids out to visit meeting houses in Clinton County, Warren County, where they could get away from the dirt and the crime in the city and have a little bit more wholesome lives out in the country. The 1860s was probably the peak of Quaker numbers and Quaker influence here in Cincinnati. They built a beautiful new meeting house, which I always thought looked sort of like a bank, at the corner of 8th and Mound. And this was also a period of much greater cultural assimilation for Quakers. In 1860, Quakers were no longer prohibited from marrying only Quakers. They were allowed to marry Quakers of other faiths. They were allowed to marry individuals of other faiths. So you had more of an influx of people from different faith traditions. And in the abolitionist work and in the social reform work, they often interacted with members of other denominations, Methodists and Presbyterians, and this had some influence. It was during this period that you began to see the Quaker plain dress starting to fall away. It may have been that they wanted to be like the other people they were working with. Quakers were also less isolated. Back in the day, when they had farms or individual businesses, they could stay more isolated and interact mostly with one another. But now they were employees and working in a post-industrial or an industrial age. They still occasionally used thou and thee with their family and friends, but they were not using it in public anymore. The late 19th century was also a period of the Great Awakening, and Quakers were influenced by some of the evangelical currents that were happening at the time. Music, for the first time, was introduced in Quaker worship. It actually kind of came in through the back door because the young kids would hear their friends singing gospel songs, and so they would come to first day school and want to sing something. And they said, well, okay, maybe we won't sing it. Would it be okay if we just said the words? Or maybe if we said the words and sang very slowly and softly and reverentially. And eventually this became, this was something that they adopted, and music was even integrated into worship. Not since Fox's time, when he went traveling through England, sharing his understanding of faith and the relationship of God with humankind, Quakers have generally not been proselytizing. But during the late 19th centuries, they did, following the lead of other denominations, begin sending out missionaries, initially to Mexico, also to Cuba, to Jamaica, to the Middle East, and to Africa. In fact, pop quiz time. Can anyone tell me the country that has the most number of Quakers in the world today? And I'll give you a hint, it is not the United States or Great Britain. Anyone know? Kenya. Kenya has more Quakers than any country in the world. And it's a result of this 19th century missionary work. In 1930, Quakers had obviously been down in the downtown area since they had originally come here, but Cincinnati was crowded, was dirty. The coal was the number one way to heat homes and businesses, so there tended to be a lot of soot, a lot of smoke. And also in the late 1800s, you saw the building of the inclines, of railroads, of streetcars, and those who had the means to get out of the basin did so. They headed for the hills. And Quakers, likewise, were accustomed to being within walking distance of their meeting house. As Quakers were leaving the downtown area, they decided to follow, and so they built in 1830 this meeting house in Quarryville. And you can see from the architecture, even though this was designed by a Quaker, it looks almost like a Methodist church, which was, again, the result of some of the assimilation that was happening. Probably the biggest change for Cincinnati Quakers was that in 1930 we decided to hire a full-time minister, something we had never had before. This caused a stir among the traditionalists. In fact, there are currently 3 Quaker meetings in Cincinnati. I'm coming from Cincinnati Friends meeting, but 2 others are Community Friends and Eastern Hills Friends, who broke off from us. And in the 1950s, one of the reasons that they left was because of this hireling ministry, as they called it. You're also starting to see a lot more, again, influence from other denominations. We would have flowers in the meeting room, which was unheard of. There would be flags, the United States flag and the Christian flag, and the traditionalists finally said, no, these are symbols, we don't do symbols, we have to put these away. And they did do that. So even though there were a lot of changes going on in terms of how we conducted worship, the values that George Fox had espoused back in the 17th century continued. And one of those, again, was the commitment to peace. Now, during World War I, the government did make provisions for what were called conscientious objectors, or COs, people who, as a matter of conscience, did not feel that it was appropriate to fight or to kill others, because after all, there is that of God in all people, and killing is something that we don't engage in. But during the First World War, it was particularly messy, because the conscientious objectors really didn't know what was expected of them. The individuals in the army didn't know quite what to do with them. They were allowed to do things like be in the medical corps or the Corps of Engineers, but they were required at first to show up to training camps. And like I said, they didn't know quite what was expected of them. Some of them refused to wear uniforms. Some of them would wear a uniform, but they would refuse to carry a gun. Someone would carry a gun, but would refuse to participate in training exercises. And often they would be beaten, they would be punished, they would be imprisoned, some were court-martialed. So the experience during the First World War was a mess. One of the things that Quakers did do at that time, the British Friends had established an ambulance service so that they could at least ameliorate the effects of war without actively participating in it. And that was known as, and the Americans came up with a very similar program to help do restoration work in France, and that was known as the American Friends Service Committee, which still exists. But during World War II, Quakers, Mennonites, and Brethren got together with government officials and said, look, we need for World War II, we need a different kind of program for conscientious objectors. We don't want to have this chaotic, abusive situation that we had previously. So what they set up were known as civilian public service camps. It was under the selective service, but it was civilian or run by civilians. They tended to be in obscure areas, so out of sight, out of mind. And they engaged in things like agricultural work, because the farmers were at war and somebody still needed to be growing the crops. They were involved in soil conservation, in fighting forest fires. They worked in mental institutions. And I think one of the more difficult things, a lot of them allowed themselves to be subjected to medical experimentation. Because, for example, if the Navy wanted to know what to put on the lifeboats, what's the minimum amount of equipment that we need to provide? Well, let's take a bunch of Quakers, put them in a raft, put them out to sea, and see what happens. Or they would go through, they were aware of the concentration camps, and they weren't sure how to bring people back from starvation level conditions. So let's starve a few Quakers, see what works. But it was, for us, better than fighting. Here in Cincinnati, we did have individuals who were part of Cincinnati Friends meeting going to civilian public service camps. But one of the things that they wanted to do on the home front here was other forms of amelioration for the effects of war. And of course, one of those was the internment of Japanese Americans right after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. They were rounded up, forced to give up their farms, their businesses, basically pack a suitcase and go to a internment camp, and were told that they could no longer live where they wanted to live, that they could live where the military said they could live, and one of those places was Cincinnati. So Cincinnati Friends rented a dormitory on Winslow Avenue from the University of Cincinnati and set up a hostel so that people who were being relocated from the internment camps to Cincinnati would have a place where they could live, where they could find a job, where they could become assimilated in this area. Cincinnati Friends were also involved in the post-war effort in sponsoring refugees and helping them to find jobs and teach them English. And here in the United States, when they had no place left to go, their homes being destroyed by the war. So we did continue with a lot of the traditional Quaker concerns regarding peace. Also very involved in the some of the early civil rights work. Now, which brings us to 1963, when we moved out to Indian Hill. You can see our meeting house in the upper right corner there, a lot less wooded than you'll see it today. This is not in the book, but anecdotally I can tell you that the land that Cincinnati Friends purchased was owned by a couple named Ben and Adrian Bernstein, and they were not particularly happy with the village of Indian Hill, I have heard. And so when they had the opportunity to sell their 5 acres to Quakers, they were more than happy to do it because it would deprive the village of the tax revenue. There were also some concerns. The neighbors wanted reassurance that there weren't going to be any bells, that we weren't going to be having big festivals. And we said, no, we are a quiet people, we will be okay. A number of our early pastors became involved in some of the local ministers groups, meeting with people from Madeira Presbyterian, St. Paul's, and the Armstrong Chapel. We had for many years joint vacation Bible school, which was very popular. And members of our meeting were also involved in the Indian Hill Dialogue Group, which I don't know if that still exists. You know if it does? Okay, there you go. We were involved in the Indian Hill Dialogue group, talking about local community issues. One of my favorite bits in researching the book was the concern, particularly during the 70s, related to the increase in drug use. And we asked our custodian to patrol the ground periodically to make sure no one was growing marijuana on our 5 acres. If the pendulum had swung very strongly toward greater assimilation beginning in the late 19th century, here in modern times, I have seen that the pendulum is swinging back to some more traditional Quaker practices. The meeting house there on Keller Road is the most traditional Quaker architecture of any meeting house that we had ever had. It was built by David Maxfield, who was a professor of architecture up at Miami University, who did extensive research into how the building should be laid out. In fact, the only thing that's atypical from classic Quaker architecture in this building is the fact that there is only one door. In the early 200 years ago, women would sit on one side, men would sit on the other, and each had their own door into the building. That again was something that disappeared in the late 19th century. And even at the meeting house at Eden Avenue in Coreyville, we did tend to have that structure with the pews facing forward and a central pulpit now that we have a pastor. And as you can see here in the lower right, we have gone back to a more communal approach to laying out the pews in facing benches. And we also have a library, which we've had since the 1830s. Friends today also continue to have a strong commitment to peace and social justice. One of our efforts to ameliorate the effects of war in recent years was to build an orphanage in Afghanistan. And in fact, to raise money for that project, we are grateful to the people of Armstrong Chapel who gave us their facility for a benefit concert. In the spirit of continuing revelation and discovering God sharing new truths with us, Cincinnati Friends also came out as being an open and affirming meeting, which means accepting of same-sex relationships. And though we did not have the opportunity to bless any same-sex unions before it became legal, we were certainly committed to doing so. And this is still a contentious issue particularly among the more evangelical friends who are still uncomfortable with that. But it's something that our meeting has felt a commitment to making the statement that this is something we support. Modern friends tend to be very environmentally concerned. When we have our fellowship after worship, we have our little compost bins where we put put scraps, and we have recycling for the paper plates and napkins. We have a little fair trade store set up for coffee and tea and chocolate that is produced in a way that adequately compensates the farmers and the workers to make sure that they get a fair deal. We also continue to support not only the shared ministry within our worship, but we have put together, thanks to bequests that we've received over the years, we have a pool of grant money that we give to members who are led to perform individual acts of ministry. One of those is Artsy Fartsy Saturdays. We have a woman who is an artist and who has felt led to have an arts ministry for underserved children. But it's obviously more than just getting together and working with drums and clay and Venetian masks. What she hopes to do is to give those kids who may come from very traumatic home situations a place where they can feel safe, where they can feel loved and respected, where Kathy can look at them and see that of God in them, and hopefully help them to see that of God in themselves. Her organic eco garden is about a 2.5 acre facility down in Over the Rhine. It is an organic garden, which is not only a community garden, but they have the funding to hire local interns, young people, so that they can teach them not only job readiness skills of responsibility and showing up on time and doing what needs to be done, but also skills in that they can transfer. Some of them have gone on to find jobs in landscaping. They teach them how to harvest. They teach the community how to eat healthfully, often sharing some of their produce with local daycare facilities. And they take their produce to Findlay Market. So they have learn business skills and learn how to market and sell what they grow there. So that is Quakers from 17th century England up until 21st century here in Indian Hill. Do you have questions that you would like to ask? Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Do the Afghan children, the orphans, practice your religion, the Quaker religion, or the Muslim faith?
No, we don't proselytize. They practice whatever faith their families or whatever faith they're like.
Do they ever choose the Quaker faith?
I don't know the answer to that. It's been a relatively the orphanage I think was I want to say 2010. So it's only, and the organization that we worked with has not been nearly as communicative as we would like. So we don't always know what's happening right now. But certainly we partnered with an organization called the Revolutionary Association of Women of Afghanistan, and partnered in them in part because of their commitment to tolerance, to equality, to educating girls as well as but like I said, they've not been as communicative as we would perhaps like.
What is the size of the
We currently have, at the height back in 1868, we had only about 255 people, so we have always been very small. We're down to about 70, 75 members, and average perhaps 30 in worship. Yes.
Do they come from all over the city?
Yes. Yes, we do. We have people who make the trek all the way from northern Kentucky. We have people come from as far north as Wilmington. We have one woman who comes from Lawrenceburg, Indiana. I think our furthest east is probably Loveland and Milford. So we are drawing people from all over the area. We're very geographically dispersed. Yes, ma'am.
You commented that you have now hired a clergy
Yes.
for the meeting. What do you look for in terms of theological training? Is there a seminary for Quakers, or what do you want in theological background for the clergy? And if you could describe the role of the clergy with a group that has in the past been self-led.
That's an interesting question. And in fact, like I said, George Fox used to say that an education in Oxford or Cambridge did not make a minister, that only God could make a minister. And in fact, our practice, we still do not ordain. If an individual shows a particular gift for ministry, we recognize that and refer to that as recording. When we first hired ministers, we had to pull from, we pulled largely actually from Hartford Theological Seminary in Connecticut. There is I don't know if you're familiar with Earlham College, that actually began as a Quaker boarding school in the 1850s and eventually became a college. And Earlham School of Religion is the theological seminary for Quakers. And of course, there is a Quaker theological seminary in Kenya to help train ministers there. That tends to be our primary source, but we have had, I'm sitting here thinking, besides Hartford and ESR, some have had theological training elsewhere. But certainly, in fact, I just finished serving on the search committee for our pastor. We just hired a new minister. Our previous minister retired last July. And certainly, it is very important for us to have someone who is familiar with Quaker practice, because our self-governing methods and certainly our approach to living out our faith is a little bit different than most other denominations. So we certainly look for someone who can support us in that journey.
How do you get new recruits?
Well, in fact, very few people who are members of our meeting today are children of Quakers. Most of them are what we call convinced friends. Some of them go out on the internet, and they may have heard about Quakers. In fact, when we had our 200th anniversary, in addition to the publication of the book, we had a number of events. There was an article in Cincinnati magazine. There was the pastor at the time and I went on WVXU and did a program about our history. So people do occasionally hear about us. I myself came into Quakerism because my brother-in-law is a Quaker. And when his father passed away, I attended the memorial service and found in them a kindred spirit. A lot of people who come into Quakerism feel that they have probably been Quakers all their lives and just didn't know it. So we try to maintain some visibility and hopefully live our lives in a way that calls attention to what we value, and hope that will be appealing. We could probably do a little bit more outreach than we do. We do have a website. We have a Facebook page. So we're not the Amish. We're not completely averse to technology, but we do tend to be quiet and low-key. Yes?
I know that you have, I'm sorry.
Oh, you want me to go ahead? Go ahead.
I just wondered, are there Quakers all over the United States or just in certain areas?
They are all over the United States, in differing concentrations. One of the, I don't want to go too much into the organizational structure. I mentioned that we are called Cincinnati Monthly Meeting of the Religious Society of Friends. The organization beyond that, which tends to be an individual congregation, is a monthly meeting. Collections of congregations gather every 3 months for quarterly meetings, and it is the responsibility of quarterly meetings to start up new meetings if it's needed, lay down ones that have that are no longer viable, and then there are larger organizations than that, which are called yearly meetings, which, as the name suggests, get together once a year. They're responsible for publishing our faith and practice, for setting up administrative practices. We're part of the Wilmington yearly meeting. So, yes, there are broad, we have yearly meetings from East Coast all the way out to California. There are meetings in Alaska. There are meetings in Hawaii. But again, some of them some are very small. And the nice thing about being a Quaker is if you feel that, because we're not a national organization, if you would like to start a worship community in your area, you can do so. Yes?
What's the term Quaker?
There's some difference of opinion on that derivation. Some because historically, because we encourage a direct experience of God. Early friends sometimes did literally tremble during worship. Hence the term quaking. In his autobiography, George Fox says that he once went to he was on trial for various irreverent practices, and and told the judge that he should tremble before the Lord. And the judge, called him a Quaker in a disrespectful manner, but the name stuck. So the official name is the Religious Society of Friends, but we are commonly called Quakers or Friends. Yes?
Is there a relationship between Quaker cereal and the Quaker?
There is not, and that's kind of interesting too. When the Quaker Oats people came up with the wanted to market their brand, they thought, well, Quakers are associated with wholesomeness and goodness, and so we're going to put Quakers on our box. Some Quakers actually did sue them over that. Now, if you want to support a Quaker company at Easter, buy Cadbury eggs. The Cadbury company is a family-owned Quaker company. Well, not anymore. Thank you. My husband corrects me. They're not. I think they're Nestle now. Yeah, but the Cadbury company was originally founded by Quakers. Barclay Bank was originally a Quaker family. Lloyd's of London was originally a Quaker family. Then we'll wrap up. Yes, sir, on the right there.
There are many shared values between Quakers and Quakers, apart from the not approving of marriage in the Shaker group. But how would you compare and contrast the essential values of the two groups?
I would have to say I'm not very familiar with the Shaker tradition. I know that it is it grew from completely different roots. I believe Shakers developed in Germany, whereas the Quakers were in England. We probably have more in common with the Mennonites and the Brethren, but certainly find common value in endeavoring to follow God's guidance in how we live.
Well, very much simplicity was a core.
Yes.
Hands to work, hearts to God.
Do you use the King James Version of the Bible, or if not, which version do you use?
We do not quibble on translation. People use whatever they're comfortable with.
Well, Sabrina, thank you so much.
Thank you. I will also put in a plug. Mary mentioned that Levi Coffin is mentioned in this DVD, but we did this as part of our 200th anniversary celebration. I'm in the film, and it does cover the territory that we have covered from George Fox through Pennsylvania, some of the wars. In fact, wonderful footage of the conscientious objectors during World War II. So if you're interested in that, this is available.
Any songs like Carrie Newcomer?
Oh, no, there are not. But she was, when we had our 200th anniversary celebration, we had Philip Gully come and speak, and we had a performance by Carrie Newcomer.
And her songs are wonderful. Right?
They are.
She's living her religion through her songs.
Absolutely.
I believe the DVDs are $10
$10?
and the books are $15. Is that correct? If you're interested in purchasing one, Sabrina will be here, and I can't thank you enough. It was just fascinating. And we have a small token of your appreciation for you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I look forward to seeing you all at the Patron Party in March. In our April program, we will be recognizing, enjoying the tales of the Harrison family. If you haven't read Don's book, it's fascinating, and I'm sure he will have it available there. So we look forward to seeing you in March and April. Thanks very much.